and still lots of people getting in touch with their sleeping habits.
Yes.
We'll
and most of them are readable.
Yeah, yes, indeed, which is good news.
Yes.
But shall we have a look through the newspapers now, through the insides of the newspapers as well, with journalist Ella Whelan and Kevin Schofield, political editor of the Huffington Post. Morning both, thanks for coming back. Kevin, we're starting with you and these awful fuel costs.
Yeah, so I think it's probably the most tangible example of the cost of living crisis. If you've got a car and you go to fill it, you instantly notice how little fuel you're getting for your money compared to even a couple of months ago. And Rishi Sunak, unsurprisingly, is coming under pressure to go even further to reduce fuel duty. If you remember at the spring statement in April, he cut it by 5 pence, which at the time seemed like a lot.
Did it?
Well, I mean, it was more than, it was at the upper end of expectations, really. But it went like that. It's long since been swallowed up.
They need to start cutting it by 50 pence, never mind 5 pence.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. So the Cabinet Ministers are making the point that half, if you add fuel duty and VAT together, half of what you pay is going straight to the Treasury, which obviously means that the Treasury are making a lot more money from it than they were
Which
previously.
arguably becomes a form of tax just on the motorist.
Exactly.
It's an extra tax.
So at a time when Rishi Sunak is coming under pressure to cut tax, so income tax, for instance, they're saying, look, actually fuel tax is what you want to be hammering, because that's where most people, as I say, are noticing it in their pocket. But he says we can't do that unless we're on a stronger fiscal footing. The government doesn't have a lot of money because of the pandemic, so they can't afford to do it. So he's under a lot of pressure. There's a budget coming in October, but can people wait till October for the government to...
But not if they can't afford to fill their car in order to do vital things, including getting to work. And they also can't then go to the railways to get to work because there are no trains because everybody's on strike. You know, what are people meant to do?
Well, quite, exactly.
You've got to, I mean, at that point, you have to turn to government and say, you've got to do something about what is an impossible situation.
Yeah, and if the government is obviously, you know, getting back to Boris Johnson's own personal problems, he's desperately trying to get back on the front foot, improve the Tories' opinion poll ratings. This is something that you would think might help to do that, but there seems to be, I think, that tension between Rishi Sunak and the rest of the cabinet, because he's the one holding the purse strings and he's saying, well, actually, hold your horses, we can't really afford it.
Sticking with the Telegraph, Ella, the Education Secretary is saying don't use rail strikes to revert to home learning. There's not that many kids go to school on a train, is there?
Well, that's certainly a question that lots of people are asking on social media. You know, the news of the strikes criticism of the strike has turned into framing around why would you do this to children? And I think this very kind of, I would say, crass way. And Zahawi is responding to, I mean, he's already made comments saying that this is basically that it's selfish for rail workers to do this at a time when lots of young people have exams. And he's doubled down on that now with the news that some schools are planning to close within that week between the 21st to the 20th and the 24th. Because they say that they know that teachers aren't going to be able to get in, and they're telling young people to go back to remote learning just for that period, which is, you know, it's just unacceptable to say that it's going to become the norm that at any time there's a hiccup or a difficulty in society that schools will shut. I mean, this is part of the pandemic hangover, in that it's normalised the idea that school would be closed. I mean, when I was at school, it was, you know, even if there was blizzards, it would be, you know, the last resort would be to close school. And we've lost that kind of sentiment of the importance of education. It's also the case that, you know, Nikki Aiken, the Conservative MP, has come out and said that striking during the exam period is unforgivable. And there's this real kind of, you know, really cheap attempt to try and suggest that the consequence of children's, you know, what we've seen in the last 2 years of kids' education being sacrificed by the closure of schools is now all the blame is going to be on RMT workers, who are these sort of, you know, the devil incarnate people who are sacrificing kids' well-being. That's completely passing the buck for a Tory MP to talk like that.
It does seem a bit odd. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm no fan of strikes because, from a very personal perspective, it causes chaos for individuals. Not to say they don't have a point that needs to be made. But no, you can't suddenly start blaming them for everything.
Well, I mean, the RMT and indeed other unions that are engaging in strikes across different sort of industries have pointed out that there is it's this really stupid idea about how strikes work. Strikes are meant to be disruptive. They're meant to be, you pick them, it's funny that no one's going on about Glastonbury, because I suppose that would reveal people's class prejudices if they moaned about it being at the time of Glastonbury. But you've got Glastonbury, you've got sporting events, you've got exam periods. That week is, if you were going to have a strike, it's the time to do it, to really show bosses what you mean. And so, it comes down to a question of whether or not you support strike action. I do. And
do you support this particular strike for this particular reason?
I do, because I think that, the RMT have a long history of being very forthright in arguing for better pay and better working conditions at times.
But their average wage is well above the national average, isn't it?
I know, but you can argue that it's all relative, but we've been talking about the fact that there's a cost of living crisis, and their argument is that wages are not meeting with inflation rises and other things, and that there's been ongoing battles. And I think that other workers across other industries should take a leaf out of their book, because we're constantly, commentators like us are constantly going on television and saying, well, what can you do about gas prices? What can you do about food prices? What can you do about this? The world's going to hell in a handcart. And this is the one thing that workers can do very effectively to make sure that their wages manage to let them survive on a very basic level.
But their average wage is well above the national average. I just wonder what's happened to community spirit. We've just been through a pandemic.
The drivers of
it may be just the drivers. They earn very well, don't they, the drivers? But they're still going on strike.
I think community spirit is, the community spirit is about, do you understand the importance of worker solidarity? Perhaps that's, revealing my political affiliations. But, the idea that it's selfish for workers to go on strike is
when
a kind of
come out of a pandemic,
misunderstanding of the nature of what you do when you take industrial action, which is, of course, it's inherently selfish. It's about your wage and your industry, but it's a more broader point about saying that workers, when they need to, have to remind bosses of their importance of their labour. And if you might call that selfish, I call that an important part of workers' rights.
We're out of time. You
Are we
two?
ready?
Yes, we are.
Oh.
Kevin, Ella, thank
Sorry,
you very much
Kevin.
indeed.